Evolution describes processes that affect populations of cells or organisms. So we recognize it as a population phenomenon of change over time. Individual organisms may grow and develop, but they don't evolve in the sense that their genetic structure is changing, so that we would recognize these changes in individuals from one generation to the next. So it is the population that is the unit of evolution.
In this population of aphids, we find individuals of different sizes, ages, and perhaps even with different genetic traits. If there's something influencing which individuals will leave offspring, and what traits will be represented from one generation to the next, we would conclude that this population is evolving. Aphids often attract predatory beetles, and as prey they are easy targets. The fate of any one individual may be a matter of luck, or it may be due to the traits expressed by the aphid, the traits of the predators, or the ecological context in which this drama over life and death plays out. Evolution is what creates the diversity of life we observe. When new species or new taxonomic groups are formed, we distinguish these macro patterns as macroevolution. And this is often through processes at work over vast expanses of time, perhaps thousands, millions, or even billions of years. But even over a single generation, evolutionary change can be observed. These micropatterns, also known as microevolution, happen anytime gene frequencies in a population change from one generation to the next. This is something easily observed in short-lived organisms such as bacteria, viruses, seasonal insects such as aphids and fruit flies. Observing microevolution in long-lived organisms such as elephants, oak trees, and humans is also possible using the right kinds of analytic tools. Charles Darwin was a 19th century English naturalist and a scientist who discovered one of nature's primary mechanisms of evolutionary change, which he called natural selection. Many scientists at the time understood that species were not fixed entities and that evolution was an important phenomenon. But it was Darwin who first worked out how natural selection operated as a sorting algorithm to enhance biological fitness. Darwin's university studies started with 2 years of medical school, which he found both boring and rather distressing at the kinds of procedures that were done without anesthesia. His wealthy father then transferred him to a divinity program in Cambridge, with plans for the young Darwin to become a country minister. After completing his studies in 1831, Darwin had an opportunity through one of his professors to join Captain Fitzroy as a shipmate on an extended ocean journey, the Voyage of the Beagle. It was during this 5-year expedition where Darwin made extensive collections and observations of the natural history found along the way, as the Beagle landed in many life zones, including tropical rainforests, coastal mountains, grasslands, and volcanic islands. The experience was life-changing for Darwin, and he returned to England to work on his collections and publish his findings on geology, island formation, and develop his thoughts on what was then called the transmutation of species. By 1842, he had sketched out the mechanism of natural selection, and in time began discussing it with his close associates. But the publication of his full argument had to wait until 1859, and was likely motivated by the similar findings of Alfred Russel Wallace, a younger naturalist who reached out to Darwin for mentoring help the year before. Both men converged on the same basic idea, that variable traits in a population will become accentuated if they improve the reproductive prospects of individuals bearing those traits. Darwin's famous book, first published in 1859, used pigeon breeding and the many fancy varieties that are possible once breeders focus on and reinforce desired traits. With just a few generations of selective breeding, dramatic changes in the appearance of birds are possible, where a breeder can go from a wild phenotype and over time produce new varieties that look and may even behave very differently from their recent ancestors. Darwin hypothesized that something similar happens in natural populations, but instead of humans determining which traits will be passed on, the conditions of a particular local environment are what matters. Darwin called this natural selection. As long as variable traits existed in a population, and the traits were heritable and conferred fitness advantages, natural selection would cause a population to evolve, and individuals within those populations would become better adapted to their environment. Natural selection can be visualized as nature's sieve. In any population where individuals are similar but not identical in every trait, some combination of traits fit better in a particular environment. Just like stones of the right size will settle at a particular layer of this array of sieves. Speciation is a separate phenomenon in nature, but is generally thought to involve natural selection, along with other evolutionary and geological processes. When we use a cladogram to represent hypotheses on evolutionary relationships, the groups at the tips of the branches are considered sibling taxa, or sibling species. The presence of a sibling group, like what we see with humans and their sibling species, chimps and bonobos, does not mean humans evolved from those siblings, any more than it would be correct to say that you evolved from your brother or sister. A correct interpretation is that sibling species share a common ancestor, in the way that you and your brother or sister have biological parents in common. The parents gave rise to their children, but the children are not identical to either parent or to other siblings. This is what Darwin meant by descent with modification. There was much that Darwin did not understand about the underlying causes of variability, as genes and chromosomes had not been discovered during his day. An Austrian monk conducting breeding experiments on peas around the same time as Darwin, but unbeknownst to him, worked out the basic laws of inheritance. This monk was Gregor Mendel. Once the significance of both bodies of work came to be recognized, a series of conferences and publications beginning in the 1930s worked to reconcile two of biology's big ideas into one coherent theory. This is known as the modern synthesis of evolution, and the theory has worked well since then to explain the diversity of life.